There is a prisoner who has lived in darkness for so long that when the door to his cell swings open, when light floods the corridor and freedom beckons with open arms, he does not run toward it. Instead, he retreats. He presses his back against the cold stone wall, wraps his chains more tightly around his wrists, and whispers to the shadows that they are his only friends. This is not a story from an ancient dungeon. This is happening right now, inside the architecture of the human mind. Imagine this prisoner more closely. Watch him as the sunlight spills across the threshold. Watch how he shields his eyes, not just from the brightness, but from what the brightness reveals. A world he no longer knows how to navigate, a freedom he no longer knows how to inhabit. The chains have become so familiar that their weight feels like gravity itself. Without them, he fears he might float away into nothingness, might dissolve into the vastness beyond the walls that have defined the boundaries of his existence for so long. This prisoner knows the dimensions of his cell with perfect precision. He knows where the shadows fall at what hour. He knows the texture of every stone, the rhythm of every drip of water, the echo of his own breathing in the confined space. This knowledge is his comfort. This limitation is his safety. The world outside may offer freedom, but it also offers uncertainty, unpredictability, the terrifying responsibility of choice. Better, whispers a voice from deep within, better to remain here where at least I know the shape of my suffering, where at least my pain has a name, a face, a familiar rhythm like a heartbeat I can set my life to. Why do we return to the pain we know? Why does the abandoned child grow into an adult who seeks abandoning lovers? Why does the criticized become the self-critic? Why do we architect our own suffering with the precision of a master builder constructing a cathedral to agony? Tonight, we descend into one of the mind's most paradoxical territories. We explore the strange gravity that pulls consciousness back toward familiar pain, the invisible addiction that binds us to our own torment, the psychological Stockholm syndrome where we fall in love with our captors and discover that the captors have always been reflections in our own mirror. This is not merely about sadness or depression, though they visit this territory often. This is about something far more insidious and far more human. This is about the patterns we inherit, the grooves worn deep into neural pathways by repetition, the stories we tell ourselves until they become the walls of our prison, and the terrifying vertigo that strikes when we stand at the edge of genuine transformation. In the next 2 hours, we will journey through the labyrinths of the psyche where suffering becomes sustenance, where pain becomes identity, where the known agony feels safer than the unknown peace. We will walk alongside the great explorers of the human interior, from Freud's consulting room in Vienna to Jung's tower by the lake, from Nietzsche's lonely mountain paths to the sterile laboratories, where neuroscientists map the brain's addiction centers and discover that we are no less addicted to our psychological patterns than the addict is to their substance. We will meet characters, both real and symbolic, who illuminate this strange terrain. We will encounter the woman who sabotages every success because failure feels like home, the man who manufactures conflict because silence feels like death, the child within us all who learned that certain kinds of pain meant we were alive, were visible, were real. But this journey is not merely diagnostic. We are not here to catalogue suffering, but to understand its secret purpose, to decode its hidden language, to learn what it has been trying to teach us all along. For within this addiction to familiar suffering lies a terrible beauty, a guardian at the threshold, a gatekeeper, who will not let us pass until we understand why it stands watch. Perhaps the suffering we return to again and again is not our enemy, but our teacher wearing a mask of shadow. Perhaps the patterns that imprison us are also the keys to our liberation, if only we learn to read their strange hieroglyphics. Perhaps the mind's addiction to familiar suffering is the last defense against something the ego fears more than pain itself, the total dissolution of who we think we are. The ancient Greeks understood this. They knew that before Dionysus could be reborn, he had to be torn apart. Before the phoenix could rise, it had to burn. Before consciousness could expand, it had to descend into its own underworld and meet the monsters dwelling there, not to destroy them, but to understand why they guard the treasure. We are all descendants of survivors. Every human alive today carries in their cellular memory the legacy of ancestors who endured unimaginable hardship, who transmitted through generations not just their genes but their strategies for survival, their methods for managing unbearable reality. And sometimes those strategies include a strange mathematics. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. Better the familiar ache than the alien wholeness. Better to control the timing of your pain than to risk being ambushed by it. This is the territory we enter now, not to judge it, not to pathologize it, but to understand it with the compassion of a scientist and the wonder of a poet. For the mind's addiction to familiar suffering is not a flaw in the system. It is the system working exactly as it was designed to work, trying to keep us safe in a world that once threatened to annihilate us. But that world has changed, and the strategies that once saved us now imprison us. The armor that once protected us now suffocates us. The walls that once kept danger out now keep growth in. And somewhere in the deeper chambers of consciousness, a part of us knows this. A part of us is ready for something new, even if that newness feels like death to everything we've known. So we begin at the beginning with a question that has no easy answer. What if the suffering you cannot escape is the suffering you refuse to release? What if the pattern you repeat is the pattern you've chosen, however unconsciously? What if the prison has no lock because you've been standing on the free side of the door all along? Let us find out together. Let us descend into the underworld of the psyche and return with treasure. Let us become archaeologists of our own inner ruins, detectives investigating the crime scene of consciousness, travelers mapping the strange geography where pain becomes comfort and comfort becomes terror. The journey begins not with an answer but with a recognition that you have felt this before, that something in these words resonates with a truth you've always known but never had language for, that perhaps tonight, in this exploration, you will finally understand why you keep returning to the familiar suffering, and in understanding, finally discover the courage to break free. Or perhaps you will discover something even more profound, that freedom was never about breaking free at all, but about understanding why the chains felt necessary in the first place. That transformation is not escape, but integration. That the addiction to familiar suffering, when finally understood, reveals itself to be a sacred guardian waiting for the right question, the right recognition, the right moment of surrender. We stand now at the threshold. The door to the cell is open. The light spills in. And the question that will guide our entire journey echoes in the darkness. Will you step into the unknown? Or will you, like so many before you, retreat into the comfort of your chains? The answer, as we will discover, is far more complex and far more beautiful than a simple yes or no. The answer is written in the very architecture of your nervous system, encoded in the patterns of your thoughts, embedded in the stories you tell yourself about who you are and what you deserve. The answer is waiting in the depths. Shall we descend? The origins, the archaeology of anguish. To understand why the mind becomes addicted to familiar suffering, we must first understand how the mind learns at all. We must travel back, not just through personal history, but through the evolutionary history inscribed in our neurons, through the cultural inheritance passed down like an heirloom of invisible wounds. Through the first moment, a human being discovered that anticipating pain gave them a sliver of control in a chaotic world. Picture, if you will, the earliest humans. Not the romanticized version, strong and free, but the real version. Terrified, vulnerable, possessed of big brains that were both gift and curse. These brains could imagine the future, which meant they could anticipate danger. They could remember the past, which meant they could learn from trauma. And in that space between memory and anticipation, between what was and what might be, the architecture of suffering began to take shape. These early humans lived in a world of genuine mortal threat. The predator in the grass, the rival tribe across the valley, the bitter winter that could starve an entire community, the child who wandered too far from the fire. Death was not abstract, it was immediate, visceral, ever-present. And so the brain evolved to be hypervigilant, to see danger everywhere, to prepare for the worst-case scenario, not sometimes, but constantly. This was not pathology, this was survival. But here is what happened. The brain that saved us then now haunts us now. We live in a world where, for most of us, genuine mortal threat is rare. We are not being chased by predators. We are not starving. We are not dying of exposure. And yet the ancient circuitry remains, scanning for danger, manufacturing threats, creating anxiety where there is only uncertainty, confusing discomfort with disaster, treating social rejection as if it were equivalent to physical death. Because, and this is crucial to understand, for our ancestors, social rejection often was death. The human infant cannot survive alone. The individual human cannot thrive outside the tribe. To be ostracized, to be abandoned, to be cast out was a death sentence. So the brain learned to fear social pain with the same intensity it feared physical pain. The circuits overlapped, the responses merged, and that wiring remains, encoded in our neurons, activated by every perceived slight, every imagined rejection, every moment when we feel we are not enough, not acceptable, not worthy of belonging. When the child of these early humans touched fire and recoiled in pain, the brain did something extraordinary. It didn't just register pain, it created a prediction model. It said fire equals pain equals danger equals avoid. This is learning at its most basic. This is survival. But the human brain, with its extraordinary capacity for abstraction, didn't stop there. It began to generalize. It began to create categories. It began to build an entire cosmology of cause and effect, of stimulus and response, of danger and safety. Consider how profoundly this shaped human consciousness. The brain that can learn fire is dangerous can also learn my crying causes my caregiver distress. My authentic self is unacceptable. Expressing my needs leads to rejection. Being vulnerable invites attack. These lessons, learned in the crucible of early experience, become the templates through which we interpret all future experience. They become the invisible rules that govern our behavior, the unspoken assumptions that limit our possibilities, the unconscious contracts that keep us bound to patterns of familiar suffering. And here is where the story becomes interesting, because the brain's primary directive is not happiness, it is not fulfillment, it is not even comfort. The brain's primary directive is survival, and survival requires prediction. The brain that can predict danger is the brain that lives long enough to pass on its genes, so the brain becomes, above all else, a prediction machine, constantly running simulations, constantly testing models against reality, constantly updating its algorithms based on feedback. But prediction requires patterns, and patterns require repetition. And repetition, my friends, is where addiction takes root. Let us move forward in time now to the consulting room of Sigmund Freud in Vienna at the dawn of the 20th century. Here, on a couch that would become legendary, patients reclined and spoke their minds, and Freud listened with an attention that was almost archaeological. He was excavating the ruins of the psyche, looking for the origins of suffering that seemed to have no present cause. And what did he discover? He discovered something he called the repetition compulsion. He observed that his patients, despite their conscious wishes to heal, despite their suffering, despite their stated desire to change, would repeat the same patterns again and again. The woman who chose abusive partners, the man who sabotaged his career at the moment of triumph, the child who provoked punishment even when safety was offered. Freud sat with this puzzle for years. It violated his earlier theories, which posited that humans were primarily motivated by the pleasure principle, by the seeking of gratification and the avoiding of pain. But here were his patients, clearly and repeatedly choosing pain, not consciously, not deliberately, but with a kind of unconscious inevitability that Freud found both fascinating and disturbing. He documented case after case. The young woman who, having finally escaped an oppressive family situation, immediately attached herself to a partner who recreated the same oppression. The businessman who, on the verge of a major success, would make inexplicable errors in judgment that led to failure. The patient who, having finally broken free from a destructive relationship, would within months find themselves in a nearly identical situation with a different person. These were not stupid people. They were not lacking in self-awareness or education or resources. Many of them were brilliant, articulate, capable of profound insight into their own psychology. And yet the pattern repeated. Knowledge was not enough. Understanding was not enough. The compulsion operated at a level deeper than conscious intention. At first, Freud thought this was about unresolved trauma seeking resolution. The psyche was trying to master what it could not master the first time, like a child who has experienced something overwhelming, playing it out again and again in their games, trying to gain control over the uncontrollable, trying to transform from passive victim to active agent. There was therapeutic logic in this. By repeating the pattern, perhaps we could finally resolve it, finally achieve the mastery that eluded us the first time. But as he went deeper, especially in his later work, especially after witnessing the unimaginable horrors of World War I and the ways in which humans seemed drawn toward destruction not just of others but of themselves, he began to suspect something darker, something more primordial. He began to suspect that there was a death drive, thanatos, in eternal conflict with the life drive, eros, that some part of the psyche actually sought dissolution, destruction, a return to the inorganic state from which it came. This was disturbing to Freud and remains controversial to this day. His colleagues resisted the idea. Even his most faithful followers found it too pessimistic, too dark, too nihilistic. But Freud insisted there was something he was observing clinically, something undeniable in the behavior of his patients and in the broader behavior of human civilization that pointed toward this darker truth, that we are drawn toward destruction as much as toward creation, toward death as much as toward life. But what if we reframe it? What if what Freud glimpsed was not a drive toward death itself, but rather a drive toward the familiar? What if the repetition compulsion was not about seeking destruction, but about seeking the known, even when the known is destructive? The brain, remember, is a prediction machine, and accurate prediction requires familiar data. The child who grows up in chaos learns to predict chaos. Their nervous system becomes calibrated to chaos. It becomes, in a very real sense, addicted to the neurochemical cascade that chaos produces. When life becomes peaceful, when stability is offered, the nervous system doesn't recognize it. It cannot predict it, and unpredictability registers as danger. So the psyche does something ingenious and terrible. It recreates the familiar chaos. It manufactures the predictable pain. Not because it seeks pain for its own sake, but because it seeks the restoration of a world it knows how to navigate. Better the demon you can name than the angel you cannot recognize. This is the dark wisdom that ancient civilizations understood intuitively. The Greeks told stories of tragic heroes doomed by their very attempts to escape their fate. Oedipus, fleeing the prophecy, runs directly into its fulfillment. The more he tries to avoid his destiny, the more certainly he achieves it. This is not merely literary device. This is psychological truth dressed in mythic garb. The repetition compulsion is the prophecy we fulfill by trying to avoid it. The suffering we return to is the suffering we know we can survive because we have survived it before. There is a terrible comfort in this, a kind of mastery through repetition. If I can orchestrate my own destruction, then I am not a victim of random fate. I am in control, even if what I control is my own suffering. Carl Jung, Freud's brilliant student who would eventually break with his master, understood this from a different angle. Jung spoke of the shadow, that part of the psyche that contains everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. The shadow is not merely our darkness, but anything we have relegated to the unconscious, anything we cannot integrate into our conscious self-image. And here is Jung's crucial insight. What we do not bring to consciousness comes to us as fate. The patterns we refuse to see, we are doomed to repeat. The suffering we will not face directly, we encounter indirectly, projected onto our relationships, our work, our bodies, our circumstances. The mind becomes addicted to familiar suffering because the suffering is carrying a message we refuse to read, performing a role in a drama we refuse to see. Jung would say that the woman who keeps choosing unavailable partners is not simply repeating a pattern learned in childhood. She is being haunted by an unlived life, by a part of herself that was abandoned, by an internal figure. Perhaps the father who was emotionally absent, who now appears in external form again and again until she turns and faces him, not out there, but in here, in the depths of her own psyche. This is the archaeology of anguish. Layer by layer, we excavate, and at each layer, we discover that what seemed like personal pathology is actually a confluence of evolutionary programming, cultural conditioning, early attachment patterns, neurobiological wiring, and the deep human need to create meaning from chaos. Consider the groundbreaking work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth on attachment theory in the mid-20th century. Through careful observation of infants and their caregivers, they discovered that our earliest relationships create templates, working models, for all future relationships. The securely attached infant, whose needs are met consistently and lovingly, learns that the world is safe, that others are trustworthy, that they themselves are worthy of care. But the insecurely attached infant learns different lessons. The anxiously attached infant, whose caregiver is inconsistent, learns that love is unpredictable, that they must constantly monitor and work for connection, that anxiety is the price of relationship. The avoidantly attached infant, whose caregiver is emotionally unavailable, learns that needing is dangerous, that distance is safety, that self-sufficiency is survival. And the disorganized infant, whose caregiver is both source of comfort and source of fear, learns that the world is fundamentally incoherent, that there is no safe strategy, that relationship itself is traumatic. These templates, formed in the first 2 years of life, become the operating system for the psyche. They determine not just how we relate to others, but how we relate to ourselves, to reality itself. They create the grooves in consciousness that future experience will flow through like water finding its ancient channels. And here is the crucial point. These templates seek confirmation, not correction. This is what makes familiar suffering so addictive. The anxiously attached adult does not simply avoid anxiety-producing relationships. They unconsciously choose partners who will recreate the anxiety they know. The avoidantly attached adult does not simply seek secure connection. They choose partners who confirm that closeness is dangerous, that distance is necessary. Why? Because the template says, this is reality. This is how the world works. This is what love feels like. And the brain, our prediction machine, seeks data that confirms its model of reality. Data that contradicts the model is often discarded as noise, as exception, as somehow not real. This is not conscious. This is not intentional. This is the operating system running in the background, beneath the threshold of awareness, orchestrating the dance of attraction and repulsion, closeness and distance, hope and disappointment, in patterns so familiar they feel like fate. In the late 20th century, neuroscience began to catch up with what psychologists had observed behaviorally. Brain imaging revealed that the circuits involved in emotional pain overlap significantly with those involved in physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, the secondary somatosensory cortex, these regions light up both when we experience physical injury and when we experience social rejection, abandonment, or loss. This is not metaphor. Emotional pain is processed as pain. And what do we know about pain? We know that the body develops tolerance to chronic pain. We know that pain itself can become addictive, that the body's natural opioids, released in response to pain, can create their own reward circuitry. We know that people can become dependent on the very thing that hurts them. But there is something even more fascinating happening neurologically. Research on neuroplasticity reveals that repeated patterns of thought and emotion actually reshape the physical structure of the brain. Neurons that fire together wire together, as the saying goes. The pathways we use most become the pathways that are easiest to access. The emotions we feel most frequently become the emotions that arise most readily. If suffering has been our constant companion, the neural pathways for suffering become superhighways. They are easy to access, familiar, worn smooth by repeated use. Joy, if it has been rare, becomes a narrow footpath, overgrown, difficult to find. The brain literally becomes structured around the familiar emotional landscape, and that landscape, for many of us, is one of familiar suffering. But we must go even deeper. We must understand the sociological and cultural dimensions of this addiction, because suffering is not just personal, it is collective. It is passed down through generations like an inheritance, encoded not in genes but in stories, in unspoken rules, in the emotional atmosphere of families and communities and entire cultures. The concept of intergenerational trauma, studied extensively in Holocaust survivors and their children, in descendants of enslaved peoples, in communities that have endured systematic oppression, reveals that trauma has a half-life that extends far beyond the individual who experienced it. The children of traumatized parents grow up in an environment shaped by that trauma, learning its lessons even if they never hear the stories, absorbing its emotional signature through the very air they breathe. This is epigenetics at its most profound. The environment shapes gene expression. Trauma can literally alter which genes are turned on or off, and these alterations can be passed to subsequent generations. The familiar suffering we return to may not even be our own suffering originally. It may be the suffering of our parents, our grandparents, our ancestors stretching back through time, each generation faithfully transmitting the pattern to the next. And there is a dark nobility in this, a kind of loyalty. To break the pattern feels like betrayal. To heal feels like abandoning those who could not heal. To claim joy feels like dishonoring those who knew only pain. So we stay faithful to the familiar suffering. We keep the vigil. We maintain the pattern, not out of masochism, but out of love, out of belonging, out of a deep and often unconscious solidarity with those who came before. This is the archaeology of anguish, layers upon layers, from the evolutionary to the neurological, to the developmental, to the cultural, each reinforcing the others, creating a system so complex and so robust that it can feel unbreakable. The mind's addiction to familiar suffering is not simple. It is not a flaw to be corrected with a single insight or a single technique. It is the result of countless adaptations, countless strategies for survival, countless attempts to create meaning and order in a world that often offers neither. But understanding the origins is the first step toward transformation. Because once we see the mechanisms, Once we understand how the patterns formed, we can begin to ask a different question. Not why am I broken, but how did I learn to survive? Not what is wrong with me, but what was I trying to protect? The familiar suffering we now see was never the enemy. It was the guardian. It was the strategy. It was the best solution available at the time to an impossible situation, and recognizing this, honoring this, is what creates the possibility of genuine change, for we cannot heal what we refuse to understand. We cannot release what we have not first acknowledged, and we cannot transform what we continue to judge as simply pathological. The origins of our addiction to familiar suffering are the origins of our humanity itself, the need to predict, to control, to create meaning, to belong, to survive. These are not weaknesses. These are the very things that make us human, and it is precisely by understanding our humanity in all its complexity and contradiction that we create the possibility of transcending the patterns that no longer serve us. The conflict, the architecture of agony. Now we descend deeper into the machinery of suffering itself. We have explored the origins. Now we must confront the mechanisms. How exactly does the mind construct and maintain its addiction to familiar pain? What are the psychological architectures, the cognitive loops, the emotional algorithms that keep us returning to what hurts us? And why? Even when we see the pattern clearly, even when we understand intellectually what we are doing, do we find ourselves unable to stop? This is where the story becomes personal. This is where theory meets lived experience. This is where we encounter the moment every person who has ever tried to change knows intimately, the moment when insight is not enough, when understanding fails to translate into transformation, when knowing better does not lead to doing better. Let us begin with a character, a composite drawn from countless real stories, whom we will call Sarah. Sarah is 37 years old. She has been in therapy for 3 years. She understands, intellectually, that she chooses romantic partners who are emotionally unavailable. She can trace this pattern back to her father, who was physically present but emotionally absent, a man who loved her but could not show it, who provided for her but could not connect with her. Sarah remembers specific moments from childhood that still carry the sting of abandonment. She remembers being 7 years old, running to show her father a drawing she had made, bursting with pride and excitement, only to be met with a distracted, "That's nice, honey," as he continued reading his newspaper. She remembers being 12 and trying to tell him about the boy at school who was bullying her, watching his face close down, hearing him say, "You'll be fine, you're tough," before changing the subject. She remembers being 16, sitting at the kitchen table after her first heartbreak, wanting desperately to be held while she cried, but receiving instead practical advice about moving on, about not being dramatic, about keeping things in perspective. Her father was not cruel. He was not abusive in any conventional sense. He simply did not have the capacity for emotional attunement. He had grown up in a generation and culture where men showed love through provision, not through presence, through solving problems, not through holding space for feelings. And so Sarah learned the fundamental equation that would shape her entire romantic life. Love equals longing. Connection equals hoping. Intimacy equals the ache of wanting someone who is just out of reach. Sarah has done the work. She has read the books, attended the workshops, processed the trauma. She knows the pattern. She can articulate it with clinical precision. She has journaled about it, analyzed it, understood it from every angle. And yet, when she meets Michael, something in her recognizes him immediately. He is charismatic, intelligent, and subtly withholding. He offers just enough attention to keep her hoping, but never quite enough to satisfy her need. He is, in other words, perfectly designed to activate every abandonment wound she carries. What does Michael look like when Sarah first sees him? He's across a crowded room at a friend's party, And there is something in his posture, something in the way he holds himself slightly apart from the group, that signals to her nervous system, this one. This is the one who will make me feel the way I need to feel. Not happy necessarily, not secure, but alive, alert, activated. This is the one who will recreate the familiar dance of pursuit and withdrawal, hope and disappointment, that feels like love because it is the only love she has ever known. And Sarah, despite all her insight, despite her therapist's gentle warnings, despite her own internal alarm bells, falls for him. No, falls is too gentle a word. She dives for him. She organizes her entire life around winning his full attention, his full commitment, his full love. She becomes addicted to the pursuit, to the intermittent reinforcement, to the brief moments of connection that feel like water in a desert. Why? Why does knowledge fail her? Why does awareness not set her free? Because the addiction to familiar suffering operates at a level deeper than conscious thought. It operates at the level of what neuroscientists call implicit memory, procedural knowledge, somatic experience. It lives in the body, in the nervous system, in the automatic responses that bypass the prefrontal cortex entirely. When Sarah meets Michael, her conscious mind may recognize the red flags, but her nervous system recognizes home, the anxiety, the uncertainty, the constant monitoring for signs of approval or rejection. This is the emotional landscape she grew up in. This is what love felt like in her foundational experience. And the nervous system, trained to seek the familiar, floods her with neurochemicals that feel like attraction, like passion, like fate. This is the cruel genius of the repetition compulsion. It disguises itself as desire. It dresses up as chemistry. It feels like falling in love when it is actually falling into pattern. And there is something even more insidious at work, the role of identity. Over time, our suffering becomes woven into who we think we are. Sarah is not just someone who experienced abandonment. She is the abandoned one. This becomes part of her self-concept, part of her narrative identity. And human beings have a powerful need for narrative coherence, for a stable sense of self that persists across time and context. To release the familiar suffering would mean rewriting her entire story, reconstructing her identity from the ground up. Who would she be without the wound? Who would she be if she were not the one who is left? The one who is not quite enough? The one who has to earn love through perfect performance? This is terrifying at a level that is difficult to articulate. The ego, that function of the psyche that maintains the sense of continuous identity, resists this kind of fundamental reorganization. Better to keep the painful but coherent story than to face the vertigo of not knowing who you are. The existential philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote about anxiety as the dizziness of freedom. When we stand at the edge of genuine transformation, when we face the possibility of releasing the familiar suffering and stepping into an unknown way of being, we experience a kind of existential vertigo. We are free, but that freedom feels like falling. We have choice, but that choice feels like annihilation. So we retreat. We return to the familiar. We choose the suffering we know because the alternative, the vast openness of possibility, is more terrifying than the pain. This is the paradox at the heart of the addiction to familiar suffering. We are both prisoner and guard. We are both trapped and trapping ourselves. The cage has no lock because we built it ourselves, and we can unbuild it, but doing so requires us to face something more frightening than captivity, the responsibility of freedom. Let us examine another dimension of this architecture, the role of secondary gains. This is a concept from psychoanalysis that refers to the hidden benefits of symptoms, the ways in which suffering serves a function beyond the suffering itself. Consider Marcus, a man who suffers from chronic anxiety about his career. He is objectively successful, but he cannot enjoy his success. He lives in constant fear of failure, of being exposed as a fraud, of losing everything he has built. This anxiety is genuinely painful. It interferes with his sleep, his relationships, his quality of life. And yet, when we look more closely, we see what the anxiety provides him. Marcus wakes every morning at 5 a.m., not because he wants to, but because his anxiety won't let him sleep past that hour. His mind is already racing, cataloguing everything that could go wrong that day, every potential mistake, every possible failure. He lies there in the dark, his chest tight, his stomach churning, rehearsing conversations, planning contingencies, trying to control the uncontrollable through the sheer force of worried thinking. He built his company from nothing, started it in his 20s with little more than an idea and determination. Now, 15 years later, it employs over 100 people. By any objective measure, he has succeeded beyond most people's wildest dreams. He has wealth, status, influence. People respect him. Clients seek him out. Competitors study his methods. But Marcus cannot feel his success. He can only feel the terror of losing it. Every achievement feels temporary, conditional, about to be revealed as somehow fraudulent. He has what psychologists call imposter syndrome, the persistent belief that he is not actually competent, that his success is due to luck or deception rather than genuine ability, that at any moment he will be exposed and everything will come crashing down. This anxiety is genuinely painful. It interferes with his sleep, his relationships, his quality of life. He snaps at his wife when she suggests he take a vacation. He cannot be present with his children because his mind is always elsewhere, running through scenarios, planning defenses against imagined threats. He has developed stress-related health issues, high blood pressure, digestive problems, chronic tension, headaches. His doctor has warned him repeatedly that he needs to reduce his stress levels. And yet, when we look more closely, we see what the anxiety provides him. First, the anxiety keeps him motivated. He works harder than anyone else because he believes that if he stops, if he relaxes for even a moment, catastrophe will strike. His anxiety is the fuel that drives his achievement. Without it, he fears he would become complacent, lazy, mediocre. The anxiety, as painful as it is also what he credits for his success. In his mind, the equation is simple. Anxiety equals productivity equals success. Remove the anxiety, and he might remove the very thing that has gotten him this far. Second, the anxiety protects him from his deeper fear that he might succeed completely and discover that success does not fill the emptiness inside him. As long as he is anxious, he can tell himself that peace and fulfillment are just one more achievement away. The next milestone, the next goal, the next level of success, that's when he'll finally be able to relax, to feel satisfied, to rest. But of course, each achievement only raises the bar, creates new things to worry about, new ways to fail. The anxiety ensures that he never has to confront the possibility that success itself might not be the answer to his existential emptiness. Third, the anxiety connects him to his mother, who was chronically anxious and who taught him that anxiety was a sign of caring, of responsibility, of being a good person. His mother worried about everything: money, health, safety, what others thought. She transmitted to Marcus the unspoken message that to not worry was to be careless, irresponsible, unloving. When Marcus was young and came home excited about something he had accomplished, his mother's first response was always to point out what could go wrong, what dangers lurked, what he needed to worry about. She meant well. She thought she was protecting him, but what she taught him was that love and anxiety were inseparable, that to care about something meant to worry about it constantly. To release the anxiety would mean facing the possibility that he might not work as hard, that he might have to confront the existential emptiness directly, and that he might have to differentiate from his mother, to live in a way that she could not. These secondary gains are often unconscious. Marcus does not consciously think, "I will maintain my anxiety because it serves these functions," but the psyche is more strategic than we give it credit for. At some level, the suffering is maintained because it is solving a problem, even if the solution costs us dearly. This is what makes change so difficult. We are not simply fighting against a bad habit or a maladaptive pattern. We are fighting against a complex system that has homeostasis built into it, a system that has organized itself around the suffering and that will resist any attempt to reorganize. The family systems therapist Murray Bowen understood this better than most. He observed that families operate as emotional systems, with each member playing a role that maintains the system's equilibrium. When one person tries to change, the system reacts to pull them back into place. The alcoholic who gets sober suddenly faces enormous pressure from family members to drink again, not because the family wants them to suffer, but because the family system has organized itself around the alcoholism, and sobriety threatens that organization. The same is true for the internal family system, the various parts of the self that have organized themselves around familiar suffering. When we try to change, internal voices arise that sound like reason, but are actually resistance. They say, "This is too hard. You'll never manage it. You don't deserve better. Who do you think you are? Remember what happened last time you tried? You'll just fail again and feel worse." These voices are not external. They are parts of ourselves that fear change, that have been given the job of maintaining the status quo, that believe, often with good reason, based on past experience, that change is dangerous. The internal family systems therapy model, developed by Richard Schwartz, offers a profound understanding of this internal architecture. It suggests that the psyche is not unitary but multiple, composed of various parts or subpersonalities, each with its own perspective, its own feelings, its own agenda. When we are addicted to familiar suffering, it is often because certain parts of us are working very hard to keep us stuck, not out of malice, but out of what they perceive as necessity. There might be a part that believes that suffering is what keeps us safe, that if we let our guard down and allow happiness, we will be blindsided by disaster. There might be a part that believes we do not deserve happiness, that we are fundamentally unworthy, and that suffering is our just punishment. There might be a part that is loyal to a family pattern that maintains the suffering out of love for those who suffered before us. These parts are not irrational, even when they seem so from the outside. They are operating from their own logic, their own understanding of reality, which is usually frozen in time at the moment they were formed. The part that believes we do not deserve happiness might have been formed when we were 5 years old and were told, directly or indirectly, that we were too much, too needy, too difficult. That 5-year-old concluded, "I am bad," and that conclusion became a fixed point around which the psyche organized itself. Decades later, even when adult experience contradicts this conclusion, even when we are surrounded by people who love us and tell us we are good, that frozen part still holds its conviction and works to maintain patterns of suffering that confirm its worldview. This is the architecture of agony. Layers of beliefs, frozen in time, defended by parts of the self that fear change more than they desire healing, maintained by homeostatic mechanisms that treat transformation as threat, reinforced by secondary gains that make the suffering functional even as it is painful. And there is one more element we must consider: the role of meaning. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz and founded logotherapy, observed that humans can endure almost any suffering if they can find meaning in it. But the inverse is also true, and it is more disturbing. Humans will create suffering if they lack meaning. In a world that often feels arbitrary, chaotic, and meaningless, suffering at least provides a narrative. It gives us something to struggle against, something to overcome, a plot for the story of our lives. The person who has no suffering might have no story, or at least no story that feels dramatic, significant, worthy of attention. This is particularly acute in modern secular cultures, where the traditional sources of meaning, religion, community, clearly defined roles and purposes, have eroded. In the absence of external sources of meaning, we create internal dramas. We become addicted to our own suffering because it gives us an identity, a purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning, even if that reason is to fight against our own pain. The writer David Foster Wallace, in his struggles with depression and addiction before his suicide, wrote about this with devastating clarity. He described how suffering can become a kind of spiritual cloak, a thing that distinguishes you, how it can make you feel special, chosen, set apart from the ordinary people who live ordinary lives with ordinary happinesses. To release the suffering would be to become ordinary, to lose the thing that makes you interesting, even if only to yourself. This is a bitter truth, but we must face it. Sometimes we cling to familiar suffering because we fear that without it we would disappear into mediocrity, into invisibility, into meaninglessness. And so we return, again and again, to the patterns that hurt us. We choose the partners who abandon us, the jobs that exploit us, the friends who betray us. We sabotage our own success. We create conflict where there could be peace. We find the dark cloud in every silver lining, not because we want to suffer, but because the suffering is doing something for us, providing something we believe we cannot get any other way: identity, meaning, connection to our past, protection from deeper fears, a sense of control in an uncontrollable world. This is the architecture of agony, complex, multi-layered, serving multiple functions simultaneously, resistant to simple solutions. And yet, and this is crucial, it is not inevitable. It is not destiny. It is architecture, which means it was constructed, which means it can be deconstructed and rebuilt. But before we can rebuild, we must fully understand what we are dealing with. We must see the system in its entirety, without flinching, without premature optimism, without the comforting lie that a single insight or technique will dissolve decades of conditioning. The conflict at the heart of the mind's addiction to familiar suffering is the conflict between the part of us that wants to grow and the part of us that wants to survive, between the impulse toward life and the impulse toward safety, between the future we could become and the past we cannot release. This is not a conflict that can be resolved through will alone. It requires something deeper: compassion for the parts of us that are holding on, understanding of why they developed in the first place, and the slow, patient work of creating enough safety, both internal and external, that those parts can finally risk letting go. But here is the descent into darkness before the dawn. What if letting go is not enough? What if the patterns are so deeply grooved, the architecture so solid, the addiction so complete that we cannot simply stop? What if freedom requires not just understanding, but dissolution? What if the only way out is through a kind of death? This is the question that haunts everyone who has ever tried to change and failed, everyone who has ever seen the pattern clearly and still fallen back into it, everyone who has ever stood at the threshold of transformation and felt the ground beneath them crumble into vertigo. Is change even possible? Or are we, as some ancient philosophies suggest, simply condemned to repeat the same patterns lifetime after lifetime until we finally learn the lesson, transcend the wheel, escape the cycle? The answer to this question will determine everything that follows. The answer will be found not in theory, but in practice, not in understanding, but in lived experience, not in knowledge, but in awakening. And so we approach the turning point, the crisis, the moment of truth. We have explored the origins of familiar suffering. We have mapped its architecture. Now we must confront its ultimate challenge. Can we truly change? Or are we forever bound to the patterns that formed us? This is where many stories of transformation reach their darkest hour, where the hero of the journey faces the supreme ordeal, where death seems inevitable before resurrection becomes possible. We have descended into the underworld of the psyche. The question now is, will we find the way back out? And if we do, will we return transformed? Or will we simply bring the underworld back with us? The answer lies ahead, in the revelation that awaits, in the understanding that can only come from passing through the fire rather than around it. The awakening, the alchemy of transformation. There comes a moment in every genuine transformation when something shifts. Not the slow accumulation of insight, not the gradual erosion of old patterns, but a sudden threshold crossing, a discontinuity, a death and rebirth in the same instant. The Greeks called it metanoia, a fundamental transformation of mind. The mystics called it awakening. The psychologists call it integration. But whatever we name it, it is the moment when the addiction to familiar suffering loses its grip, when the architecture of agony reveals its secret purpose, when the prisoner realizes the door was never locked. This moment cannot be forced. It cannot be manufactured through will or technique. It arises, paradoxically, not from trying harder to change, but from finally stopping the struggle, not from pushing the suffering away, but from turning toward it with complete and fearless attention. Let us return to Sarah, whom we met in the previous act. After months of pursuing Michael, after countless cycles of hope and disappointment, after one more devastating conversation where he could not commit, would not commit, she finally reached a breaking point, but it was not the breaking she expected. It happened on a Tuesday evening in early autumn. The light was fading through her apartment windows in that particular way that always made her feel melancholic, vulnerable, exposed. She had just ended a phone call with Michael, brief, frustrating, leaving her with more questions than answers. The familiar ache was rising in her chest, the tightness in her throat, the emptiness in her stomach. She knew this feeling intimately. It had been her companion for as long as she could remember. Usually at this point, she would do one of several things. She might call a friend to analyze the conversation, searching for signs she might have missed, clues about what Michael was really feeling. She might pour a glass of wine and scroll through social media, numbing the pain with distraction. She might write him a carefully crafted text message, trying to find the perfect words that would finally make him understand, finally make him choose her. She might journal, analyzing her own behavior, cataloging her mistakes, planning how to be different, better, more appealing next time. But on this particular evening, something shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was grace. Maybe it was simply that the pain had finally reached a threshold where the old strategies no longer worked. Whatever the reason, Sarah found herself doing something she had never done before. Nothing. She was sitting alone in her apartment, feeling the familiar ache of abandonment, the familiar sense of not being enough, when something unexpected happened. Instead of doing what she had always done, analyzing what she did wrong, planning how to win him back, imagining scenarios where he would finally choose her, she simply sat with the feeling itself. At first, it was almost unbearable. The feeling, without the distraction of trying to fix it or escape it or understand it, was like a wave threatening to drown her. Her entire body wanted to move, to do something, anything, to make the feeling stop. Every cell was screaming for relief, for distraction, for the familiar strategies that promised to make the pain go away. But Sarah stayed. She stayed with the sensation in her chest, the tightness that felt like her heart was being squeezed in a vice. She stayed with the emptiness in her stomach, the hollow ache that seemed to reach all the way to her core. She stayed with the collapse in her shoulders, the heaviness in her limbs, the exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. She dropped beneath the story, beneath the interpretations, beneath the meaning-making, and felt the raw sensation of the abandonment wound in her body, a tightness in her chest, an emptiness in her stomach, a collapse in her shoulders, and for the first time in her life, Instead of trying to fix the feeling, or escape the feeling, or understand the feeling, she simply allowed the feeling to be exactly as it was. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. She lost track of time, and gradually something extraordinary began to occur. The feeling, when met with complete acceptance rather than resistance, began to move. It intensified at first, almost unbearably, like a wave building to its peak. Sarah's breath became ragged. Tears came, hot and fast. Her body shook, and she let it. She let the wave crest and crash and break against the shore of her awareness, and then slowly the feeling began to shift, to transform, to release. The intensity didn't disappear, but its character changed. It became less like drowning and more like being held by something vast, less like pain and more like, she struggled to name it, tenderness, compassion, a kind of gentle, heartbreaking recognition. And beneath the familiar pain of abandonment, Sarah encountered something she had never expected to find, a vast stillness, a spaciousness, a presence that had been there all along, underneath the drama, underneath the patterns, underneath the familiar suffering. She encountered, for perhaps the first time in her conscious adult life, herself. Not the self constructed from wounds and adaptations and survival strategies. Not the self that needed external validation to feel real, but a deeper self, a more fundamental self, a self that existed prior to and independent of any external circumstances. This is the beginning of the awakening. This is the moment when the addiction to familiar suffering begins to lose its power. Not because the patterns suddenly disappear, not because the wounds are instantly healed, but because the relationship to them fundamentally shifts. The contemporary meditation teacher Tara Brach calls this practice radical acceptance. The therapist Carl Rogers called it unconditional positive regard. The Buddhists call it equanimity. But the essence is the same. When we stop fighting our experience, when we stop trying to be anyone other than who we are, when we meet our suffering with the same loving attention we might bring to a frightened child, something in the system relaxes, the grip loosens, space opens, and in that space we discover that we are not our suffering. We are the awareness that holds the suffering. We are not the pattern. We are the consciousness that witnesses the pattern. This is a subtle but profound shift in identity, from being the content of consciousness to being consciousness itself. But let us be clear, this is not a one-time event. This is not a single dramatic awakening after which everything is different forever. The patterns of familiar suffering have deep roots. They will arise again. The difference is that now when they arise, there is a part of us that can recognize them for what they are. Old programs running, familiar grooves, the momentum of conditioning. There is a part of us that is not captured by them, not identified with them, not addicted to them. The neuroscientist Richard Davidson has spent decades studying the brains of advanced meditators and discovered something fascinating. Meditation does not eliminate difficult emotions or painful thoughts, but it changes the brain's relationship to them. It strengthens the prefrontal cortex, particularly the areas involved in self-awareness and emotional regulation. It reduces the reactivity of the amygdala, the brain's fear center. It increases connectivity between different brain regions, allowing for better integration of cognition and emotion. Davidson's laboratory at the University of Wisconsin has produced hundreds of studies documenting these changes. They've used sophisticated brain imaging techniques, fMRI, EEG, MEG, to observe what happens in the brains of people who have dedicated years to contemplative practice. And what they've found is revolutionary. The brain is far more plastic, far more capable of change than we once believed. One particularly striking study involved long-term Buddhist monks who had accumulated over 10,000 hours of meditation practice. When these monks practiced compassion meditation, generating feelings of loving kindness toward all beings, their brain scans lit up in ways that had never been observed before. The gamma wave activity, associated with heightened awareness and cognitive processing, reached levels far beyond what is normally seen in humans. The insula, involved in empathy and interoception, showed dramatically increased activation. Most remarkably, these changes persisted even when the monks were not actively meditating, suggesting that years of practice had permanently rewired their baseline brain function. But you don't need to be a monk with 10,000 hours of practice to experience neuroplastic change. Studies have shown that even 8 weeks of mindfulness meditation practice, just 20 minutes a day, produces measurable changes in brain structure. The hippocampus, involved in learning and memory, increases in gray matter density. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, actually shrinks slightly, becoming less reactive. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function and emotional regulation, shows increased thickness and connectivity. In other words, contemplative practice literally rewires the brain in ways that make us less enslaved to our automatic patterns, less addicted to our familiar suffering. Not because the suffering goes away, but because we develop the capacity to hold it differently, to respond to it differently, to not be overtaken by it. This is the essence of neuroplasticity at the service of liberation. The brain that was wired through repetition to return to familiar suffering can be rewired through different kinds of repetition, practices of awareness, acceptance, self-compassion, to respond in new ways. Consider what happens neurologically when we practice the 5-step process I outlined earlier. When we pause before acting on the impulse to return to familiar suffering, we are strengthening the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, literally building the neural infrastructure for self-regulation. When we bring curiosity rather than judgment to our patterns, we are activating the same brain networks involved in scientific inquiry and creative problem-solving, approaching our own psychology with the same openness we might bring to exploring a new landscape. When we feel the feeling in the body without the story, we are integrating the emotional brain with the rational brain, creating coherence between systems that often operate in isolation or conflict. When we offer ourselves compassion, we are activating the same neural circuits involved in caregiving and social bonding, but directing them inward, literally becoming a secure attachment figure for ourselves. Each repetition of this practice creates and strengthens neural pathways. Each time we choose awareness over automaticity, we are voting with our attention for the kind of brain we want to have, the kind of person we want to become. This is not metaphor, this is not wishful thinking. This is measurable, observable, scientifically verified neuroplasticity. But there is another dimension to the awakening that we must explore, one that moves beyond the individual to the transpersonal. Jung spent the second half of his life investigating what he called the collective unconscious, that layer of the psyche that contains not personal memories but archetypal patterns shared by all humanity. He believed that true transformation required not just integration of the personal shadow, but connection to something larger than the individual self. Jung observed that people who went through genuine psychological transformation often reported experiences that seemed mystical or spiritual. They encountered forces, energies, or presences that felt numinous, sacred, beyond the personal ego. He came to believe that the psyche naturally moves toward wholeness, toward what he called the self with a capital S, the totality of consciousness that includes but transcends the ego. In this understanding, the addiction to familiar suffering is not just a personal neurosis. It is the ego's resistance to its own transcendence. The familiar suffering keeps us locked in a known, contained, personal drama. It prevents us from facing the vastness, the mystery, the uncontrollable reality of existence itself. To release the familiar suffering is to release the illusion of control, the fantasy that if we just manage our psychology well enough, we can keep ourselves safe from the fundamental uncertainty and impermanence of life. This is why the awakening often involves a kind of surrender, a giving up, a letting go not just of the suffering, but of the one who suffers. The contemporary spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle describes this as a shift from psychological time to presence. Psychological time is the realm of past and future, of memory and anticipation, of regret and anxiety, of the story of me and my problems. Presence is the realm of the eternal now, where the stories dissolve and what remains is pure awareness, pure being, untouched by the dramas of the personality. For many people, the first taste of this presence comes in moments of crisis, when the familiar suffering becomes so intense that the psychological structures holding it in place collapse. The addiction reaches its breaking point. The system can no longer maintain itself. And in the rubble of the collapse, something else emerges, not a better story, but the end of story itself. Not a healed self, but the discovery of what was never wounded in the first place. This is what the mystics have always pointed to. This is what the meditation masters have tried to transmit. This is what psychedelic research is now revealing through carefully controlled studies. That consciousness is not confined to the personal self, that there are states of awareness where the boundaries between self and other, between self and world, become permeable or dissolve entirely, and in those states, the familiar suffering is revealed to be a construction, a habit of mind, rather than an absolute reality. But, and this is crucial, this revelation does not mean that suffering disappears. It means that our relationship to suffering changes. We see that while pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. While difficult emotions will continue to arise, we don't have to construct an entire identity around them. While losses will continue to occur, we don't have to create a story of permanent deficit. The addiction to familiar suffering was always a case of mistaken identity. We thought we were the one who suffers. We discover we are the space in which suffering arises and passes. We thought we needed to fix ourselves. We discover we were never broken. We thought we needed to earn our worthiness. We discover we are worthy by virtue of existing. This discovery is the alchemy of transformation. Lead into gold, suffering into wisdom, wound into gift. But this is not a denial of the reality of pain. This is not spiritual bypassing or toxic positivity. This is a hard-won maturity that comes only from passing through the suffering, not around it, from meeting it fully rather than defending against it. Let us consider Marcus again, the anxious achiever. His transformation did not come from conquering his anxiety through sheer willpower. It came when he finally stopped fighting it, when he allowed himself to feel the fear fully, to drop into the body of anxiety itself. And there, in the center of the fear, he found something unexpected, a grief so profound it had no words. Grief for the child he was, who believed he had to earn his right to exist. Grief for all the joy he had sacrificed in pursuit of safety. Grief for the life unlived, the spontaneity suppressed, the freedom foregone. And when he allowed that grief to move through him, when he wept for that lost child, something softened. The anxiety didn't disappear, but its grip loosened. He discovered he could feel anxious and still move forward. He could carry uncertainty and still find peace. He could be imperfect and still be whole. This is the paradox of transformation. We change not by trying to become someone different, but by fully accepting who we are. We heal not by rejecting our suffering, but by bringing it into the light of compassionate awareness. We transcend the patterns not by fighting them, but by understanding them so completely that they lose their unconscious power over us. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote to a young poet, "Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. This is the secret the familiar suffering has been keeping all along. It is not our enemy. It is not a design flaw. It is not evidence of our brokenness. It is a messenger from the depths carrying information about where we are stuck, where we are defended, where we are still refusing to love ourselves fully. The addiction to familiar suffering is the psyche's cry for integration. Every return to the pattern is another opportunity to finally get the message, to finally understand what part of us needs attention, needs healing, needs to be brought into the wholeness of who we are. This is why the awakening is never complete, why the journey is never finished. We do not arrive at a state of permanent enlightenment where suffering never arises. We arrive at a capacity to meet whatever arises with presence, with compassion, with the understanding that this too is part of being human. The contemporary teacher Pema Chodron speaks of the wisdom of no escape, the understanding that we cannot outrun our humanity, cannot transcend our vulnerability, cannot escape the basic facts of existence, that we will experience pain, loss, aging, death. But we can change our relationship to these facts. We can stop adding suffering on top of pain, stop creating elaborate strategies to avoid the unavoidable, stop being addicted to familiar suffering as a way of maintaining the illusion of control. This is what genuine freedom looks like, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of spaciousness, not the elimination of suffering, but the end of the addiction to it, not perfection but wholeness. Not invulnerability but resilience, not knowing all the answers but being comfortable with the questions. The future of human consciousness, if it is to evolve, must move in this direction. We must learn, collectively, to hold our suffering with more wisdom, to see through the patterns that keep us stuck, to recognize the addiction to familiar suffering for what it is, an obsolete survival strategy that once served us but now limits us. Technology may offer some assistance in this evolution. Brain-computer interfaces may one day allow us to more directly observe and modify our neural patterns. Psychedelic-assisted therapy is already showing remarkable results in helping people break free from addiction, depression, and PTSD by temporarily disrupting the default mode network and allowing new neural connections to form. Virtual reality might offer new ways to practice responding to triggering situations in a safe environment, rewiring the automatic reactions that keep us trapped. But no technology can replace the fundamental work of turning toward our suffering with courage, of bringing compassionate awareness to the patterns that bind us, of choosing again and again to meet ourselves with love rather than judgment. This is the work of being human. This is the evolutionary edge we are all navigating, and every person who does this work, who breaks free from their addiction to familiar suffering, who integrates their shadow and embraces their wholeness, contributes to the collective awakening of consciousness itself. We are not separate. The patterns we carry are not just personal. The suffering we transform is not just our own. We are part of an interconnected web of consciousness, and every healing sends ripples through the entire system. This is the promise and the challenge of the awakening, to recognize that we are both utterly alone in our individual experience and completely interconnected in our collective humanity. To know that while no one can do our inner work for us, we are not doing it alone. To understand that the familiar suffering we are addicted to is both uniquely ours and universally human. The awakening is not an arrival. It is a continuous unfolding, a perpetual return to presence, a moment-by-moment choice to meet what is with awareness rather than reaction, with acceptance rather than resistance, with love rather than fear. And in making this choice, again and again, we discover that the familiar suffering loses its addictive pull, not because it disappears, but because we are no longer seeking from it what we thought it could provide: identity, meaning, protection, control. We find these things elsewhere, in presence, in connection, in creative expression, in service, in wonder at the mystery of existence itself. We discover that we do not need the suffering to feel alive, to feel real, to feel worthy of love. We were always alive. We were always real. We were always worthy. The suffering was just the long, circuitous route we took to remember what we never actually forgot. That we are consciousness itself, playing in the forms of time, experimenting with identity, learning through experience, evolving through relationship. The addiction to familiar suffering was the dream we needed to dream in order to wake up. And now, having woken up, we can choose to dream a different dream. Or we can rest in the awakeness itself, the pure presence that preceded and will survive all our stories, all our patterns, all our suffering. This is the alchemy of transformation, not changing base metal into gold, but recognizing that it was always gold, that the suffering was the disguise, that the wound was always the gift in disguise. Liberation and the continuous becoming. We have journeyed far, through the origins of suffering, through its intricate architecture, through the revelation of its secret purpose. We have descended into the underworld of the psyche and emerged with a kind of treasure, not the elimination of suffering, but the understanding that transforms our relationship to it. Think about where we began, with the image of the prisoner retreating from the open door, wrapping his chains more tightly, choosing the familiar darkness over the unknown light. That prisoner was not a fool. That prisoner was not weak. That prisoner was following a logic that made perfect sense within the context of his experience. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. Better the predictable pain than the unpredictable freedom. And now, having traced the origins of this logic through evolutionary history, through developmental psychology, through neuroscience and attachment theory, through the stories of Sarah and Marcus and countless others, having mapped the architecture of agony and witnessed the alchemy of transformation, we arrive at a simple but profound recognition. The prisoner was always free to leave. The door was never truly locked. But freedom required something more difficult than simply walking through an open door. It required understanding why the door needed to be locked in the first place. So what does this mean for your life? What does this mean for the moment you close this video and return to the ordinary world with its ordinary challenges? What does this mean for tomorrow morning when the familiar patterns arise again, when the old wounds ache, when the addiction to familiar suffering whispers its seductive promise? Come back to what you know. It means you now have a choice you didn't have before. Not a simple choice, not an easy choice, but a real choice nonetheless. The choice to pause, the choice to notice, the choice to ask, is this familiar? Is this a pattern? Is this the old addiction calling me back? But let me be specific about what this choice looks like in practice, because understanding is not enough. Insight alone will not set you free. You need a method, a practice, a way of being with your experience that slowly, gradually, inexorably shifts your relationship to the familiar suffering. When the pattern arises, and it will arise, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps in an hour, perhaps even as you watch this video, the first step is to catch it early. Learn to recognize the telltale signs, the familiar tightness in your chest, the familiar spiral of thoughts, the familiar impulse to reach for the thing that has always hurt you. These are not your enemies. These are alarm bells, signaling that an old program is activating, that the addiction is asserting itself. The second step is to pause. Do not act on the impulse. Do not make the phone call, send the text message, pick the fight, sabotage the opportunity, whatever your particular pattern looks like. Just pause. Create space between the stimulus and the response. This pause is sacred. This is where freedom lives. The third step is to bring curiosity rather than judgment. Instead of berating yourself, "Here I go again. I'm so broken, I'll never change. Simply observe, this is the pattern. This is the familiar suffering trying to pull me back. How interesting. What is it offering me right now? What does it promise? What am I afraid would happen if I didn't follow it? The fourth step is to feel the feeling in your body without the story. Drop beneath the narrative, he doesn't love me. I'll never succeed, I always fail. And feel the raw sensation. Where is it located? What is its texture, its temperature, its quality? Treat it like a scientist studying an interesting phenomenon, like a poet attending to the subtlety of experience. This is not about making the feeling go away. This is about being with the feeling so completely that it no longer has unconscious power over you. The fifth step, and this is crucial, is to offer yourself the compassion you have been seeking from external sources. Place your hand on your heart. Speak to yourself the way you would speak to a frightened child or a beloved friend in pain. I see you. I'm here. This is hard. You're doing the best you can. You are not alone. This may feel awkward at first, artificial, even ridiculous. Do it anyway. The brain learns through repetition. Each time you offer yourself compassion instead of judgment, you are creating new neural pathways, new possibilities, new patterns, and in that pause, in that noticing, in that asking, you create space. And in that space, the automatic response is no longer quite so automatic. The familiar suffering is no longer quite so compelling. The pattern can still arise, but you are no longer completely identified with it, no longer completely overtaken by it, no longer completely addicted to it. This is freedom. Not the fantasy of a life without difficulty, but the reality of a life where difficulty does not define you, does not limit you, does not keep you bound to the past. Remember Sarah. Remember Marcus. Remember yourself in every moment you have returned to the familiar suffering and wondered why. You were not weak. You were not broken. You were human. You were following the deepest programming of your nervous system, the most ancient strategies of your survival, the most loyal patterns of your belonging. And now you are learning something new. You are teaching your nervous system that safety is possible without suffering. You are showing your psyche that identity is possible without wounds. You are demonstrating to yourself that meaning can be found in growth, in creation, in connection, not just in struggle. This learning takes time. Be patient with yourself. The patterns formed over years or decades will not dissolve in a moment. But every time you notice, every time you pause, every time you choose presence over pattern, you are rewiring your brain, reshaping your psyche, reclaiming your freedom. And something else happens too, something harder to measure, but no less real. You become a beacon for others. By doing your own work, by breaking free from your own addiction to familiar suffering, you give others permission to do the same. You demonstrate that transformation is possible. You embody the truth that we are not condemned to repeat the past forever. This is the collective dimension of individual healing. This is why your inner work matters not just for you, but for all of us. We are mirrors for each other. We are models for each other. We are, in the deepest sense, each other. So as you move forward from this moment, carry with you the understanding that has been unfolding throughout this journey, that the familiar suffering is not your enemy. It was your teacher. It was your guardian. It was the path, paradoxically, to your freedom. Honor it, thank it, and then, gently, kindly, courageously, release it. Choose, in this moment and in every moment that follows, to meet yourself with compassion rather than judgment. Choose to greet your patterns with curiosity rather than shame. Choose to respond to your wounds with love rather than fear. This is the great work of being human in this time. This is the evolutionary edge of consciousness itself. This is your purpose, your calling, your contribution to the future, to break the cycle, to heal the pattern, to end the addiction to familiar suffering, and in doing so, to create space for something new to emerge. What that something new is, you cannot fully know in advance. It will reveal itself as you walk the path. It will unfold as you practice presence. It will emerge as you continue choosing awareness over automaticity, acceptance over avoidance, love over fear. But this much is certain. It will be more alive than the familiar suffering. It will be more authentic than the false identities. It will be more expansive than the prison of patterns. It will be more connected than the isolation of wounds. It will be more real than anything you have known before, because it will be you, not the you constructed from adaptations and survival strategies, not the you trapped in time at the moment of wounding, but the you that has been there all along, underneath the layers, behind the defenses, beyond the patterns, the consciousness that animates your form, the awareness that witnesses your experience, the being that has never needed fixing because it was never broken. This is who you are. This is who you have always been. And the familiar suffering, for all its pain, for all its persistence, for all its addictive pull, has been the strange and difficult path back to this recognition. So the question is not, how do I escape my suffering? The question is, what am I learning from my suffering? What is it asking me to see? What part of me is it trying to protect? And am I ready, finally, to meet that part with love? When you can answer yes to that last question, when you can turn toward your suffering with the same tenderness you would bring to a frightened child, everything changes, not all at once, not perfectly, not permanently, but genuinely, really, truly. The addiction begins to loosen its grip. The patterns begin to reveal their plasticity. The future begins to open its doors, and you, the consciousness that was always free, begin to remember what freedom feels like. This is the promise. This is the possibility. This is the invitation that has been extended throughout this entire journey, to wake up from the dream of necessary suffering, to see through the illusion of permanent damage, to recognize the addiction for what it always was, a strategy that once served but now limits, a guardian that once protected but now imprisons, a story that once made sense but now needs revision. You are the author of that revision. You are the architect of your own transformation. You are the consciousness that can choose moment by moment to return to the familiar suffering or to step into the unknown freedom. Which will you choose? The answer need not be given now. The answer will be given in every choice you make, in every moment of awareness you cultivate, in every instance of self-compassion you offer, in every pattern you notice but do not follow, in every wound you acknowledge but do not identify with. The answer will be written in the ongoing story of your life, in the way you show up tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. In the way you meet your suffering when it arises. In the way you treat yourself when you fall back into old patterns. In the way you celebrate when you choose differently. So go now. Go with the understanding that you are not alone in this journey, that countless others are walking the same path, doing the same work, facing the same challenges. Go with the knowledge that transformation is possible, that the brain is plastic, that the psyche is resilient, that consciousness itself is on your side. Go with the awareness that you were never the one who needed to be fixed, but always the one who had the power to heal. Go with the recognition that the familiar suffering, for all its pain, was pointing the way home. And go with this final truth, this ultimate insight, this deepest recognition, that you are not your suffering, you are not your patterns, you are not your wounds. You are the vast awareness in which all of these arise and pass, the infinite consciousness that was never bound by any story, never limited by any pattern, never diminished by any wound. You are and have always been free. The only question now is, will you remember? Will you remember who you truly are beneath the familiar suffering? Will you remember the choice you have in each moment? Will you remember that the addiction, powerful as it is no match for the force of conscious awareness turned toward itself with love? Remember, choose, transform. This is the way forward. This is the path of awakening. This is the journey from addiction to freedom, from pattern to presence, from familiar suffering to unprecedented aliveness. The journey is yours, the power is yours, the freedom has always been yours. Claim it. Thank you for walking this path with me, for diving into the depths of the psyche, for confronting the difficult truths, for staying with the journey even when it led through darkness. May you find, in your own life, the freedom that awaits on the other side of familiar suffering. May you break the patterns that bind you. May you heal the wounds that define you, and may you discover, as so many have discovered before you, that you were never as broken as you believed, never as limited as you imagined, never as separate as you felt. The mind's addiction to familiar suffering ends when we finally understand what it was trying to teach us. That lesson is love, self-love, unconditional, unwavering, unearned love. The kind of love that was there before the wounds, that will be there after the patterns, that is there right now, waiting for you to recognize it, to claim it, to become it. You are that love. You always have been. Remember,